Thank you very much for coming to this Lines of Thought talk. I'm Michael Spender, I'm the Museum and Arts Manager for the Borough of Poole, and I'm delighted to be introducing Isabel Seligman to you today. She's Curator of the Lines of Thought exhibition. Isabel is the Bridget Riley Art Foundation Exhibition Curator at the British Museum. Having studied English literature and history of art, she worked at various organisations including the Institute of Contemporary Arts, the Townhouse Gallery in Cairo, and Christie's Old Master Department. She's written for publications including Artlist and Apollo, and is currently working on researching the museum's modern collection of drawings for an upcoming show of American prints to be held at the British Museum in 2017. When Hugo Chapman, the keeper of prints and drawings at the British Museum, spoke at the opening of Lines of Thought a few weeks ago, he described the exhibition as the most significant, wide-ranging drawings exhibition ever to have left the British Museum. And he praised Isabel's skills at managing to get a range of curators to release their precious drawings for one exhibition like this. In addition to curating this extraordinary exhibition, Isabel has written the accompanying book, this, which I would like to commend to you. It's a fascinating read, it's beautifully illustrated. Every drawing in the exhibition is illustrated in colour in the book, and there are more drawings besides illustrated. It was officially published on the 22nd of September and is selling like hotcakes. In fact, we've just secured the last available copies from the first print run, and they are in our shop. So I just warn you that it might not be available for a short time while they do the second print run, so bear that in mind when you go back down to the shop later on. Now I'd ask you please to welcome Isabel Seligman.
To dissect something means to take it apart for the purposes of examining its internal structures and the relationships between them. Today I'm going to share some thoughts with you about the project I've been working on over the last 2 years, how it has explored and challenged some contemporary ideas and prejudices about drawing through looking at its history, and how this has influenced the curation of the exhibition Lines of Thought currently in the galleries. All of this starts with Bridget Riley and her own experiences at art school in London in the 1960s. By the time she was a student at Goldsmiths, drawing was already viewed as something that could be dispensed with. Life drawing classes were optional, and it was only due to her own conviction that it might benefit her artistic development that she pursued them, as well as going to the British Museum study room to see drawings by the past masters for herself. Riley has credited observational drawing as the key to all of her subsequent discoveries in painted abstraction, and as her drawing career began in the study room of the British Museum, so did our project. National collections and artists go back a long way. When the Louvre first opened its doors to the public, 3 out of 5 days of the week were reserved solely for artists. The late Lucian Freud described his visits to the National Gallery as rather like going to the doctor to look for some help. Apparently it was especially helpful in working out ears, which, as you can see from this drawing, he sometimes had a bit of trouble with. Frank Auerbach still visits on a weekly basis. However, since the heyday of the Academy, when drawing was the foundation of any art education, things had changed dramatically. At the start of my tenure, there were no formal partnerships with art schools in London, and only 2 classes had been scheduled for the coming year. The aims of the Bridget Riley Art Foundation were twofold: to emphasise the importance of drawing and demonstrate the significance of responding to graphic works to the development of artistic practice. also to encourage art students to draw from the works in the British Museum's collection. Over 2 years, I and my colleagues Sarah Jaffrey and Rebecca Birrell have held more than 100 workshops for over 700 students from schools across London and the South East, including the Architectural Association, the University of Brighton, the Mary Ward Centre, Open College of the Arts, Royal College of Art, Royal Drawing School, the Slade, and University of the Arts London, which comprise Camberwell, Central St Martin's, Chelsea, London College of Fashion, and Wimbledon. Students working across all disciplines of fine art, including painting, sculpture, performance, installation, video, sound, and photography, came to the study room to look at drawings. Each workshop followed roughly the same format, which used 10 to 15 drawings chosen to respond to a specific theme. They began with a period of close looking, followed by discussion, before proceeding to draw from the drawings. The intentions behind these workshops were threefold. Firstly, they were an opportunity to introduce students to the wealth of resources presented by the museum's collection. Of the first 250 students asked, not a single one had previously heard of the museum's study room. This was our chance to open up access to the collection and spread the word about the museum's incredible holdings. With nearly 50,000 drawings to choose from, we had pored over the collection for months in order to ascertain what might particularly excite their interest. We wanted to illustrate the broadest possible chronological range, from the 14th and 15th century to the contemporary, in the widest possible range of media. From 19th century drawings in ink by Francisco Goya to a contemporary drawing in ink by Cornelia Parker, a drawing from the 70s by Eda Renouf in red chalk, to an 18th century drawing in the same medium by Waterloo. Charcoal, as it was used by Gillray in the Renaissance, but also by Willem de Kooning in the 20th century. Also silver point, as used by Paul Noble last year, and Raphael, used 500 years ago. Although I have to say, so far I've only found one drawing done in the artist's blood. From inchoate doodles to highly finished presentation drawings, we wanted to show students the whole gamut of treasures available. In addition to an introduction for students, these workshops were also a fact-finding mission for us. They allowed us to identify students' interests, modes of practice, and engagement. In other words, to find out how, if at all, drawing featured in their practice, and how looking at other types of drawing could develop this. In order to do this, talking formed an integral part of each workshop, discussing students' practice and interests. Thirdly, they could act as a testing ground and focus group for us to find out what drawings and types of drawings students enjoyed seeing as well as drawing from, which they didn't and why. As a curator, this was a real opportunity for me to work in dialogue with people who were a core intended audience for the show, to ask them questions about how they perceive drawing, its functions and its possibilities. For this reason, as well as the discussions that we had during these workshops, we also handed out feedback questionnaires so we could get some of these answers on paper. These have proved an invaluable resource, and I will quote from them where possible throughout this talk. The first challenge was that students are not encouraged to look at historical works in the course of their studies. Although they might have encountered artists such as Michelangelo, Leonardo and Gillray at school, by the time they got to university, they were encouraged only to look at 20th century and contemporary artists. We sought to overcome this bias by mixing up old and new works within the workshops and resisting a chronological layout. This was also one of the reasons why, if we showed works by the great canonical artists, we wanted to show their working drawings, to show that Leonardo da Vinci also struggled with problems, also had second, third and even fourth thoughts, and that far from being a weakness, this was actually integral to the whole process of developing an idea. In that way, drawings can be so much more valuable to a student than a finished work, such as this drawing by Michelangelo, a study for the Last Judgment on the wall of the Sistine Chapel. While the finished work has such authority that it can seem almost to have been achieved by magic, As one student wrote, the drawing forces you to think about how things are constructed. We found that students still tended to gravitate towards the more modern works, and that it was only through encouraging them to ask questions about the older works, about their appearance, medium, subject matter and function, they began to consider them as living objects that were at one time also contemporary. One example is this drawing by Andrea Comedy that was drawn on the outer sheet of a letter. His name and address is visible here in the top left-hand corner, and the wax seal is visible on the right. There are another 3 studies for this particular unexecuted fresco in the Palazzo Quirinale in Rome, all on the backs of letters. It speaks both of the expense of paper at the time, but also perhaps of an all-consuming idea, which incited the artist to pick up the nearest available scrap of it on numerous occasions. It also shows us the ways in which his flexible imagination has reacted to the existing marks on the page, the angels bending around the seal and address as if they were architectural features in the design of the intended fresco. By placing modern and historical works side by side, we also created new contexts for these works, and attempted to look at the historical works very much from the perspective of a contemporary maker. We tried to choose works which shared a conceptual link in addition to medium or subject matter. For example, in this Rembrandt drawing, the artist examines his own features and the play of strong directional light, possibly candlelight, on them. His mouth is open, possibly intended to communicate surprise. There is much discussion about whether such works by Rembrandt constitute self-portraits proper, or are merely studies of expressions for use as models in later paintings. But it seems incontestable that the artist is investigating his own body as a starting point and site of experimentation. In this etching by the sculptor Antony Gormley, the artist has pressed his mouth to the etching plate to leave an impression in the soft ground. Gormley examines the potential of his own body for mark-making, extending the reach of drawing from its usual confinement to the hand. The appearance of a blinding light which seems to emanate from the aperture, an inversion of the shadowy mouth in the Rembrandt drawing, places us inside the body, looking outwards. Gormley had described the orifices in this series of etchings as the windows of the soul, borrowing a phrase from William Blake, which is perhaps comparable to Rembrandt's own attempt to examine the outward manifestations of internal states. Another perhaps unexpected comparison is between the work of the 18th century satirist James Gillray and the neo-primitivist 20th century founder of stand art, A.R. Penck. Although Gillray was a master printmaker before his formal artistic training at the Royal Academy Schools, he was initially apprenticed to Henry Ashby as a lettering engraver. Whether the inscription is in his own hand has yet to be confirmed, but there is a certain affinity between the dots and flourishes of the lettering, also to be found in the drawing above, that would perhaps seem to suggest this. Penck's self-portrait was drawn at a time of extreme isolation, when the artist was living in East Germany and being smuggled catalogues of exhibitions that were happening in the West by his dealer Michael Werner. Penck drew this self-portrait in response to Andy Warhol's remark contained in one of these catalogues that an artist should be like a machine. He began in the top left-hand corner and worked his way from left to right like a typewriter, finishing in the bottom right. Both of these drawings ask questions about conditioned marks, learning and skill in a medium that is usually supposed to communicate an unmediated expression of an artist's ideas. Another connection, and one which you can see illustrated in the exhibition downstairs, is between drawings by the contemporary Ethiopian-American artist Giulio Moretti and the 18th century architect and printmaker Giovanni Battista Piranesi. Moretti creates her drawings and paintings in response to architectural views, plans and diagrams, which she projects onto the canvas, or sometimes, in the case of drawings, traces. She responds to these palimpsests of found lines with her own gestural marks, and has described her work as narrative maps without a specific place or location. Piranesi's fantastical space was created in response to a set design by Filippo Juvara, one of his contemporaries. In his creative interpretation of Juvara's towering space, Piranesi alters the format from horizontal to landscape, the numerous arches suggesting a labyrinth of interconnecting spaces, but one of dizzying breadth instead of height. However, he retains Juvara's innovative use of the double vanishing point, visible in the two empty spaces here and here, which multiplies the number of possible perspectives, an invention of set design that he appropriates for himself. Both Piranesi and Moretti respond directly to existing maps or depictions and play with the conventional rules of perspective in order to complicate these imaginary spaces. Another challenge we faced was that students were working in many different disciplines, from painting and sculpture to performance and installation. The art historical classification of drawing has usually been dependent upon their perceived use or function, working backwards from a known finished work in another medium. The 20-page entry on drawing in Grove's Dictionary of Art lists only 3 functions of drawing. They are grouped as 1. Creative, generating and formulating ideas. 2. Study drawings, i.e. preparatory drawings produced in the execution of another work of art or design. The 3rd is presentation and contract drawings. The workshops provided us with an opportunity to examine the relationship between drawing and other media, as well as being a site of inquiry and experimentation in its own right. Useful points of departure were drawings by artists most famous for work in other media. For example, those by Barbara Hepworth and Rachel Whiteroot. 2 artists primarily known as sculptors, but whose drawings are often very far from what one would conventionally describe as sculptural. Despite the description here of Hepworth's drawing as sculptural form, while some forms are given the illusion of 3-dimensional shape with shading, most of them are resoundingly 2-dimensional. Far from being a blueprint for a later 3-dimensional work, they are parallel inquiries and often finished works in their own right. Yet the artist is described as a sculptor rather than a draftsman or woman. Similarly, with these drawings by Rachel Whiteroot, it's worth noting at this point that many contemporary drawings and most historical drawings are untitled, with descriptive titles often being given to them by cataloguers. Thus, although this drawing is given the description "study for floor," relating it to one of the many sculptural casts of floors Whiteroot made during this period, the drawings also function as an independent examination in their own right, as communicated by this other study more neutrally titled Pink. A further challenge was that students were unused to looking at drawings in general, and often treated them as images rather than objects. They were often taken aback at how different drawings were in the flesh, compared to seeing them on a computer screen or reproduced in the pages of a book. One of the students commented that there is a completely different feeling experiencing these artworks up close. A good example is one of the drawings that's actually in the exhibition downstairs, a work by the contemporary artist Ariana Larue. This is how the drawing appears on our website. Here is a magnified section of it, which reveals a portrait that is almost purposefully hidden due to the lack of hierarchy of marks and the prominence given to the figure's environment. Here it is magnified again to show you the type of mark that the artist is using. Even if it were possible to zoom into an image like this online, or in this presentation, it would never be possible to look at both the whole piece and a detail of it at the same time. Impossible to gradually discern a subject, to work out the optimal distance to stand in front of it in order to appreciate both the part and the whole, a possibility central to the meaning of the artwork. Experiences such as this showed students that while an online catalogue is a useful way to explore the collection, it by no means replaced it. Perhaps the most contentious part of the workshops was usually drawing from the drawings. We had been told by one tutor that students might even be hostile to drawing and were more likely to keep a blog than a sketchbook. We remedied this by providing them with sketchbooks on arrival, but the feedback forms often held telling comments about the role of drawing in art education. One student had written, "This is why I was so interested in doing the workshop, as in art school today drawing is not seen as crucial, so I don't draw as much as I'd like to." However, other students revealed that an aversion to drawing was even deeper ingrained. Reasons included being scarred by A-level, where drawing was used purely as a means of responding to works of art encountered within strict boundaries of correct photorealistic style, or a perception of drawn responses as merely copying, inauthentic or derivative. One student wrote, "I think the best way is to study other artists' drawings rather than copying, because that's where you can learn. Copying might just be a mechanical process." This apprehensiveness dates at least as far back as Reynolds and Hogarth, both of whom wondered about the best way of learning from historical works. Reynolds had worried that students might sleep over their work if their minds were not employed in the process, and Hogarth called it cold copying. However, this is to ignore the analytical element of drawing from drawings, the desire to find out how an effect is achieved, how something is constructed, but also its potential for interpretation and self-discovery. Matisse spoke of his quasi-religious attendance at the Louvre as a way of acquainting himself with his own process. As he wrote, "For me, having left the Beaux-Arts, I spent my time in the Louvre, copying and submitting myself to the influence of such undoubted masters as Raphael, Poussin, Chardin, and the Flemish. I felt that the methods of the Impressionists were not for me. I wanted to see beyond their subtle gradations of tone and continual experiments. In short, I wanted to understand myself." Unhappy with the methods of his contemporaries, Matisse had recourse to the artists of the past to help him find out his own way of working. As one student went on to note, "We, or I, am inclined to forget that working from other artists is very helpful in pushing one's own boundaries." Another assumption about drawing was revealed when another student wrote that they prefer working from finished paintings or real-life sculpture, as drawings tend to dictate my style more. This highlights the false reputation of drawing as a reproductive rather than an analytical tool. The assumption that if you're drawing from a drawing, you have to draw in the same way, versus perhaps drawing from a sculpture or a painting, proves hard to shake. In addition to recommending the importance of selection in copying, Reynolds also recommended to the students at the Royal Academy, "Instead of copying the touches of the great masters, you must copy only their conceptions. Instead of treading in their footsteps, endeavour only to keep the same road. Labour to invent on their general principles and ways of thinking." Some illustrations of where these analytical and interpretive drawings can lead are currently on display in the British Museum, where student work is being shown alongside some of the drawings that inspired them. The fragmentary glimpses implied by Ariana Larue's drawing here, combined with this drawing of a sculpture as studied by Paul Cézanne over a period of 30 years, led one student, Ying Zhu, to create her own drawn response. Drawn from photographic collages of fractured statuary, the drawing seems to crystallize numerous glimpses into a kaleidoscopic melee. Another student, Eliza Wimperis, was influenced by what she called the peculiar physicality of the spiral form in this drawing by Elke Wagner. In order to explore this, Eliza's response was drawn not by hand, but with the pencil attached to her foot as it moved through the 5 classical ballet positions. As well as exploring the technical restraint and control of the body as a means of expression in other disciplines, it also speaks to the translation of bodily movement to marks on a page that lies at the heart of all drawing. In addition to this display of student works, one of the most gratifying elements of the workshops was the section of the feedback forms which asked students if their views about drawings had changed. One student wrote, "It made me question my aversion to drawing. Can I use drawing in my work other than just to sketch out ideas?" Another wrote, "It allowed me to think more about what actually happens to me when I draw, instead of how the final outcome will turn out." drawings need not be well thought out images, but rather you thinking. While a third simply wrote, drawings don't have to be correct. Many noted that photography had become the primary means of interacting with the work of other artists, but regretted that this was the case, losing both the chance to study a work for a prolonged period of time and the insights that can generate. As one student wrote, drawing forces you to study the decisions that others have made. Another feature was the number of students who had reacted to the sheer variety of drawings, with one commenting, "Different types of drawing are useful for different reasons, and this workshop has reminded me that drawing has many purposes beyond what I currently use it for." For this reason, I wanted the exhibition to cover as many different types of drawing as possible, but for all of them to be the kind of working drawing discussed previously, that all show an artist's thinking. There are numerous art historical precedents for this conception of drawing. The 16th century art historian Giorgio Vasari referred to drawing as pensieri, or thoughts, and the 17th century critic Roger Peale described drawing as the manner in which a painter thinks things. The 20th century conceptual artist and performance artist Joseph Beuys referred to drawing as his thinking medium, and this is a particularly apt phrase because it reveals the duality of the process, which is a vehicle for both recording thought and promoting it, a medium in which to think. The exhibition is thus structured around the premise of drawing as a thinking medium, with works grouped not chronologically, but according to the different types of thought process which drawing both records and promotes. Initial thoughts, brainstorming, inquiry, association and development are all visible in drawings by artists working centuries apart, and bringing their works together demonstrates what can be learned from looking at masters of the past in the context of those working today. This concept meant letting go of some cherished drawings that didn't quite fit the bill. I didn't want drawings, for example, that showed the results of an inquiry, but the process of that inquiry. So I had to let go of this gorgeous Holbein, in which every instance of working out is absent, leaving us with some of the most refined lines imaginable. Nor, however, did I want drawings like this Daumier, where all of the decisions are so numerous and unresolved that we can't follow the artist's line of thought at all, although it might tell you something about his mental state. I also had to relinquish false friends, such as this drawing from the school of Roger van der Weyden. When it was acquired in the 1940s, it was believed to be an original design for a glass painting, but more recent scholarship has suggested that it is much more likely to be a copy after one, either as practiced by a student or to make a record for the workshop. Similarly, this drawing by the British sculptor Lynn Chadwick, although it is described as a study for watchers, it was almost certainly drawn after the sculpture's production, as was the artist's habit, who preferred to make what he called three-dimensional drawings with iron rods, saving ink and paper for working from the sculpture itself. This rubric for working drawings, which show evidence of an artist's thoughts, would also seem to rule out the kind of highly finished presentation drawings, where most of the workings up have been coloured. This was why I was particularly happy to find this drawing by Sebastian Laplace, which appears at first sight to be a highly finished print study in his etching, The Academy of the Sciences and the Fine Arts. So you can imagine how happy I was to find this evidence of the way Leclerc has created the image out of many tiny collaged pieces of paper. In Making Light, you can see the joins between these pieces of paper, for example along the top of the globe and also around most of the figures in the foreground. The whole sheet is a giant jigsaw puzzle of corrections. So now that I've showed you a few things that I had to leave out, as well as one that I was very happy to be able to put in, I want to show you a few star drawings, each illustrating the different types of thought process that this exhibition examines. The first section is a general introduction to the concept of drawing as a thinking medium, showing second thoughts, revisions in drawings made nearly 3,000 years apart. This sheet shows a papyrus from the Book of the Dead, drawn in around 940 BC. A At first sight, the drawing might seem highly static and finished. However, on closer inspection, one can see the red draft lines where the anonymous artist originally planned out the composition. In this way, you can also see the artist's modifications and adjustments. Similarly, in this contemporary drawing by Michael Landy, made in 2000, which is a plan for a piece of performance art, Breakdown, which he completed in 2001. I've got a photograph of it here, and this was of the conveyor belts that destroyed all 7,227 of his possessions. The drawing also shows numerous revisions and adjustments. Both drawings are also concerned with ritual and performance, and both possibly maps for a potential afterlife. As one student wrote, I was very excited to see the Michael Landy performance plan because, having read and written about this work, I never had the opportunity to see any original evidence of this. They were quite right, as this drawing only survived the destruction because it was given to his dealer before the start of the piece. In this way, both of these drawings are also relics. From this introductory section, with only 2 drawings, we move on to the first section proper, the likeness of the thought. This section examines the ways in which drawing is fundamental to any artistic process, through recording initial thoughts, ideas and impressions. Drawing is often the fastest and easiest way to externalise an idea, acting almost at the speed of thought. Historically described as primi pensieri, or first thoughts, this type of exploratory drawing can provide clues as to how artists approach problems or proposals, formulate questions for themselves, or how the germ of an idea is born. For example, in this drawing that we looked at earlier by Barbara Hepworth, a plan for a winged figure forces the viewer to reconsider the notion of a sculptor's drawing. It captures a very specific energy or atmosphere rather than being a 2-dimensional blueprint or design for a 3-dimensional work. Although a sculpture did eventually grow out of this drawing, Hepworth considered her drawing a parallel practice rather than a preparatory one. As one student wrote, I was drawn to the exciting energy of this Hepworth. Another drawing from this section is the sketch that we looked at earlier by James Gillray, which again forces one to reconsider the notion of a printmaker's drawing, as it has not been connected to any known print. The familiar features of the print's region were almost certainly drawn from memory, and it might possibly have been done as a warming-up exercise or purely for his own amusement. Another 2 are this gorgeous black chalk sketch, probably done on plein air by Rembrandt, and another by Piet Mondrian. Both Dutch painters made these studies in the open air for later development back in the studio. Both also used a schematic line to represent the relationship between solid and void in a tree's boughs. They also both show a rhythm of vertical, horizontal and diagonal marks, which resonate across the centuries between them. Moving on to the next section, brainstorming. Brainstorming as a way of thinking hinges upon excess. A profusion of ideas are thrown down onto the page, most of which will be discarded, enabling a kind of thinking through doing. In generating multiple possibilities, brainstorming provides a vital space for the testing of ideas, placing them side by side for comparison, or on top of one another in a palimpsest. Michelangelo was responding to the biblical text of the Last Judgment. You can see here 2 groups of crouching figures, both different solutions to the same problem. Most of them were retained, and only one figure here, the angel strangling the damned soul, was removed, possibly deemed too controversial for the walls of the papal chapel. Here we have another brainstorm in response to a text, this time in response to James Joyce's Ulysses, where Harold Bloom foresees himself in a bath, his genitals a languid floating flower. You can also see a mushroom over here that he probably left in, despite its lack of textual precedent, for the sake of further ideas that it might stimulate. Here we have Andrea del Sarto brainstorming the different ways of communicating a pointing youth, a gesture that was necessary to designate the subject as John the Baptist, who identified and bore witness to Christ, hence the pointing. The third section is inquiry and experiment. Observational drawing and formal probing of abstract elements are both examined in this section, along with works which inquire into the properties of materials and push the boundaries of drawing as a practice. Here we have the drawing by Paul Cézanne we have already seen, from a sculpture that he drew continuously, analysing it from different perspectives and attitudes and in combination with other still life objects. This can be compared perhaps to this beautiful sculptural drawing by Fra Bartolomeo, which exemplifies a particular type of close observation, the artist having dipped the fabric in liquid clay to enable prolonged study. The incredible evocation of volume is perhaps in stark contrast to the presumed sculptor's drawing here by Rachel Whiteread. This is one of many drawings that the artist drew in order to investigate the parquet floor in her Berlin apartment over the course of the year that she spent there in 1993. The subjective line, I'm afraid you can't quite see it in this slide, but is very much at odds with the graph paper that it's drawn on, which I hope you'll be able to have a look at when you see it in the gallery downstairs. Two students wrote, "I was initially drawn to the Rachel Whiteread because of its evidence of process. It has made me question and consider how drawing can play a more significant role in my practice. Rachel Whiteread is turning something known into something unknown through drawing." This Ariana Larue drawing, which we've already had a quick look at, again illustrates the way in which we can follow the path of an artist's eye. Although it may seem unfinished, this is the final work, and the artist claims to know that the drawing is finished when the white of the paper is activated. This section also looks at the way in which drawing can view a subject from many different perspectives, such as in this drawing by Jacques Behind, of a member of a North African trade group in The Hague. The man is obviously educated, writing in a ledger book, and the number of different perspectives could either be staged or perhaps a study from everyday life. This drawing from Samuel Palmer's sketchbook, when he was just 19, shows a number of different views of a leaf, from above, underneath, and the side, perhaps with an invented background, as with so many that he added in this particular sketchbook. However, while drawing may be an excellent problem-solving tool, a disciplined analytical method is only one approach to any problem, and the process of drawing is particularly conducive to associative thinking, complementing a more rational inquiry with a space in which to explore and dream. Answers often appear in the places we least expect them, such as in this drawing by Watteau. The hart's tongue fans, which were the original subject of Watteau's examination, also reveals the unexpected perspective of an 18th century house, a byproduct of the original inquiry. An example of associative thinking is visible in this automatic drawing by the British surrealist Ethel Cahoon, which she used as a vehicle for illustrating the subconscious. This is comparable to the 18th century artist Alexander Cousins' two landscape studies in a blot manner. Here this artist was experimenting with ink blots to aid his invention of landscape compositions. Some other associative links can be seen in this drawing by Henry Moore, which shows mother and child forms along the bottom line and tree forms along the top. This makes a lovely pair with this Rubens drawing. The lower half of the sheet shows a fall of the damned with all the requisite beasties and fantastical creatures. And when rotated 180 degrees, it also shows a lion hunt. I can show you, there's the lion appearing there, roaring. And there it is again, at the top, and there, and rotated 180 degrees. The final section considers drawings that after any initial exploration and experiment need to undergo a process of development and definition, discarding elements that don't work and refining those that do. This process includes as much destruction as creation, and such drawings allow us to see artists changing their minds, revising and retracting. They thus offer us the unique chance to view the minds of some of the world's most astonishing artists in operation. Such as Albrecht Dürer's drawing here, A Study for the Figure of Fortune. I'm afraid you can't see it very well in this illustration, but you'll be able to see it downstairs. That Dürer has used the Vitruvian canon of proportions to inscribe with a stylus squares underneath the figure's body. He's also tried out alternative wings, and as one student wrote, I was particularly drawn to the Dürer as it comprised two ideas in one drawing. Another in this section is this Study for Blaze by Bridget Riley from 1962. The collage central piece of paper shows the artist changing her mind as it covers up an earlier attempt. One of the drawings which shows the artist moving from one side of the paper to the other is this drawing by Claude, the recto done en plein air in the Roman Campagna, and then the verso traced through after the artist had placed the paper on a piece of glass, perhaps to reverse the composition for use in another painting. And the final drawing I'm going to talk about is this by Leonardo, where the artist explores multiple alternative outlines in a dizzying flurry of ideas, and again carrying over from one side of the paper to the other. In conclusion, this exhibition also attempts to dissect drawing, to divide it into its constituent parts and work out the relationships between them. It is not prescriptive, it does not attempt to tell you the right or the wrong way to draw, but only how others have used this tool as a means of pointing out its almost infinite possibilities. In the words of one student, drawing can also be the scaffolding that is left behind. I hope that with this scaffolding, we can give people the materials to construct whatever they need, and open up drawing to a new generation of artists. If anyone has any questions.
You had one there, preparation for an angel wings or something?
This one by Dürer, quite recently.
No, not that one.
Oh yes, yeah. The Barbara Hepworth from the Brainstorming.
That's right, that's the one.
Winged figure, yeah.
There is currently something that looks very much like that, a finished three-dimensional product in the Tate Modern at the moment, made of polyester resin and glass fibre. Have you seen it?
I haven't seen it, but I know that there are quite a number of editions of that particular work. So that's interesting. I didn't know it was on show at the moment.
Yes, that's one. As soon as I saw that, I thought that was
absolutely.
I saw a couple of weeks ago in the Tate.
So probably the most famous version is the one that's on the side of the John Lewis building on Oxford Street, which is huge, about 20 foot high. But then she also did a number of smaller ones, which were actually, they came before the large one, and it was when she was asked to kind of rework some of these smaller sculptures for a commission for John Lewis that she turned it into this huge 20-foot sculpture. But yes, you're absolutely right. Good spot. Any other questions?
Yes, I was particularly interested in your sort of outtake section for the ones that didn't make it. Did you have a chance to play Van Gogh in it? What were your thoughts on that? Because that seemed to be the one person I thought, oh, he's not here.
You're absolutely right. That was incredibly fraught, because we actually only have one Van Gogh drawing in the whole collection. And so, as you can imagine, it's in quite high demand. And unfortunately, that was one of the ones that's been out too much in the last couple of years. So actually, it'll probably be another 10 years or so. Yeah, before we can show it again. But it is illustrated in the introduction to the booklet, so you can see it there, or come to the department and see it yourself. Yes.
Previously down, you said, I think it was Ariana Larue, said that drawing is finished when the white of the paper is activated. I was struggling with that. Can I have your take on it?
Yes, absolutely.
Could you repeat the question, please? Now, in one of the
No, sorry, I'll speak
Shall I do it?
Repeat the question before
Yes.
she gives the answer. We can't all hear the question.
Shall I
from here,
repeat the question again?
if you wish to. Yes.
I was asking about the quote from Ariana Larue, one of the pictures, the one with the sort of half-finished look. He said, "Drawing is finished when the white of the paper is activated," and I wondered what that meant, and if we could have an explanation.
Sorry, I'm just trying to find the drawing so that you can look at it. I can't speak for the artist, but if you want my take on it, this is actually also something that Henri Matisse spoke about in relation to both his drawings and his prints. And I think the point is that every mark that you make as a positive drawn mark affects the space around it. And so when you're building up these marks and you're creating a figure on this white ground, you're also affecting the shape of the ground around it. So she's thinking both about the positive shapes that she's making with the drawn marks and also the way that's changing the shape of the ground. And it's actually, as you can see here, sort of approaching the two sides here, it gets more and more charged as it approaches that kind of a kind of tension here. And if you think about how that acts on the whole of the rest of the page, the kind of mise en page, the composition of it on the page, I think that's what she's talking about. Does that help at all?
That one becomes more and more fascinating when we look at it.
Yeah, no, that's cool. Any other questions? Yes.
I think the exhibition downstairs is absolutely excellent. So why was Poole chosen for the exhibition to come here?
That's a really good question. And why was Poole chosen to host the exhibition? So there are actually a number of museums who all approached us to take this exhibition. And one of our sort of key criteria was the museum to make the most of it. And one of the key intended audiences was art students. So actually your proximity to Arts University Bournemouth and the number of workshops that we've had here for students has really kind of proved us right on that front. I think we've had sort of at least one per day for the whole of October. So yeah, no, that's really kind of a key factor in our decision. Any other questions?
Hi. When you had your study days with students,
Yes.
you say you supplied them with a sketchbook.
Yeah.
And what other media to make marks with?
Good question. So we provided them with all types of grades of pencil, and we also said if anyone wanted to bring any of their own dry media, they were absolutely welcome to. The only thing that we can't really have is wet media.
Yeah, I just think because lots of the artists use charcoal and
Yeah.
dry point. If you
Yeah.
explained
Yeah. I think that's
what they were.
Yeah. No, I think we definitely started off with sort of the close looking followed by discussion, which was really our opportunity to talk about the different media that the artists are using. And actually sometimes it's very frustrating not to be able to use kind of wet media or...
No, it doesn't have to be wet though.
Yeah.
Use a charcoal can make so many different types of marks.
Absolutely.
It's mark making.
Yeah. It can be frustrating to be quite so limited, but then in other ways it's quite nice to be sort of limited in the scope of your marks and have to be kind of inventive about what
Yeah,
you're
so
doing.
if you discussed it with them, that's all.
Yeah, no,
You can
absolutely.
make different marks.
Yeah,
different
definitely.
medias.
Yeah. Any other questions?
So you find that students are limited by their age?
By their age?
Yeah.
In what way?
Well, myself not being young anymore, I want to get much more into my art now than I had when I was younger. And obviously life goes on, and I've had a family and all the rest of it. And now I'm really interested, and I just find that I feel that perhaps if I was 20, I'd have a lot more opportunities to do things than I would at 50.
That's an interesting question, and actually one of the art schools that I mentioned, the Mary Ward Centre was, I think, an adult learning centre, and quite a few of them offer kind of mature learning courses.
It's Mary who?
Mary Ward Centre.
Mary Ward?
Yeah.
Right, so where is that based?
That's based in London. Correct me if I'm wrong, but also the Open College of the Arts is a distance learning college, and they have people in from all over the country, and you can submit work and have
So, but you usually find that it's the younger ones that you, obviously because of their age, are prioritising rather than the older students or whatever.
I think within the class we don't tend to prioritise at all, and we have tried to sort of take on as many sort of different types of higher education, further education as possible. And really for the course so far, we've just focused on reaching out to as many art schools in London as possible, really, and just try and open it up for everyone.
Thank you.
I'm curious, you talked about star drawings, and you had an Egyptian drawing and a Landy drawing.
Yeah.
I put this together the way I thought it. And you talk about a thinking medium.
Yeah.
We're kind of part of the Descartes era, forgive me for saying that. In other words, I think, therefore I am. The Egyptians didn't belong to that period. So what's the, they didn't think of thinking as important. And indeed, I thought about Landy, I checked him out in the book.
Yeah.
Born in 1963, so he's part of the heart transplant generation, if you like. The way we think about thinking is quite different, certainly to a lot of the drawings that you've shown us. They're pre-Cartesian and pre-thinking is important. I don't know whether you could comment on that, sorry, it's a bit complicated.
No, I think that's a really good question, actually, about the kind of trans-historical nature of the exhibition, and whether you can really compare drawings from such different historical periods, and sort of looking at something, whether you can actually intuit what the artist was thinking when they were drawing that. I'm not sure there's such a strict boundary between sort of thinking and not thinking at Descartes, but I think that is a really valid question.
What I'm thinking of is about the drawing coming from the heart rather than the mind, I suppose. Maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah, I think, again, the distinction between heart and mind is quite a contested one. But I think you're definitely right to sort of problematise this idea that
because Leonardo, he's a mind person, isn't he?
Yes, I mean, he's definitely of a generation of primarily conceptual artists. But I think I was looking for what they had in common rather than the differences between them in this particular.
And so what do they have in common?
Well, they both show artists using drawing to think, really, to plan something out.
It's about the Book of the Dead, isn't it?
Yeah.
So so you're drawing a parallel with the thinking about death?
Yes, absolutely. But in this particular case, the material traces of that. So this spell from the Book of the Dead was really a map for what they thought would happen in the afterlife and all the trials that they would have to go through. This
so it was a spell, was it?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, in this case, the kind of material traces of that in drawing. Yeah. Thank you very much. Any other questions?
There's no other questions. Perhaps I'd like to just thank Isabel for coming down from London all the way to Poole. And I think it's been an excellent talk, and hopefully there's been a lot of ideas there for us to absorb, which will heighten your appreciation of things. So thanks very much indeed.